A very common obstacle that we have as an athlete or as a coach is trying to figure out what changes to make to our programming and when. And I think it's obvious that anytime that we're writing a new program, whether as a self-coach athlete or as a coach for a new athlete, is trying to figure out what works for that athlete as quickly and as accurately as possible. And by what works, I mean what gets them that consistent and constant progress at the end of each block, and as well as a lot of predictability within that performance. We can leverage that to plan PRs at the end of a block and obviously make sure we have the highest performing day possible at a meet as well. And with that, I'm a very large proponent that if we find that system that works very well for an athlete, that we try to not make too many changes too early and try and really leave that alone as much as we possibly can and run it into the ground and really, I guess, milk it for all it's worth, making sure that we get as much progress as possible out of this system and this set of exposures that we have designed for this particular athlete. So we try to make changes too early, that's where we'll see that, hey, we left some on the table for what we're doing. And when we try to make too many changes without seeing something really come to fruition, we might not have enough data to kind of make the appropriate and informed decision making to move forward with the next plan. So really the win gets to be quite simple in my eyes. Obviously there's going to be some outliers here, but whenever we stop seeing that really nice, just continuous progress, and we stop seeing those metrics that we're tracking have a good continual improvement, that's where we kind of go back to the drawing board and say, hey, all right, we've gotten all we can out of the last 4, 5, 6 blocks, if not longer. But what changes do we make now in order to keep this needle moving and keep getting us the results that we need? So that's what we're going to talk about today, is actually what types of novelty can we introduce at the end of, I guess, the life of a previous system, and what's the most appropriate decisions that we can make moving forward. And what's really crucial for making these changes to our programming is, once again, that we have some proper data tracking in place for us to help us make these informed decisions. Like, say if we know an athlete has always done very well at, a certain rep range or a certain level of tonnage or a certain amount of working sets, we're not going to just completely flip that on its head and do the exact opposite. And I do want to kind of preface it, that's something that I think is very cool about this realm, sport, whatever you want to call it, is that, say if you've been working with an athlete for a long time, there's been several times where I've been working with somebody, 2, 3, 4 years, and something that just really did not work for them 2 or 3 years ago works very well now. And I'm not saying that you need to just go to the opposite or go to something that you did in the past and didn't work just because on the chance it might work. I think that still, even with that, there needs to be a good, just, logical and intelligent thinking and design behind why, like, hey, X, Y, or Z didn't work 2 years ago, but everything that we've been seeing lately is trending towards, like, hey, that might be something that works really well. So I'm saying just because it didn't work a couple years ago or even a year ago doesn't mean it's not worth a try now if things are leading to that appropriately. So today we're going to be talking about what actual changes do we need to make in order to, once again, get that needle moving. What's some specific things that we can do to help us have that intelligent decision making? But before I jump into, I'm going to kind of turn this into more of a case study about one of my local athletes here that we did some really cool stuff just by tracking some metrics and seeing like what connected the dots. And it's just a very, I guess, specific example on the broader spectrum of how we could be using this knowledge to apply to programming and get a lot of the same benefit out of some novelty without really having to change the rules, so to speak, of his programming. But before we jump into that and be talking about some more simple concepts so that we're not, we're stepping over dollars to pick up pennies for that sort of analogy. Because obviously we can jump into program design and have a lot of great progress there, but there might be some simple things that we can talk about first. So let's cover our bases there. So one of the first obvious things that we can jump into is our accessories. I know that might not be as fun or as flashy as trying to change like frequency of our bench press or trying to change our tonnage or working sets of our bench press or anything like that, but it's a very simple change that might change the enjoyment of training from a really positive standpoint too, but still have a fantastic yield on our performance and transference on our performance on squatting, bench pressing, and deadlifting. And I think that's something that's really oversought in just what kind of large array of equipment we could possibly have as an athlete to what we can actually do to, once again, find an accessory. I think the most important part there is that it's something that we can progress. Like say if we go choosing, a pec fly, like nobody's going to be able to go from doing 20 on pec flies, 20-pound dumbbells and pec flies up to, 100-pound dumbbells. That's just not very reasonable. So the level of progression there is not very ideal, as well as obviously it's not very similar to a bench press, right? But if we look at something more like a dumbbell bench press, or if we look at like a weighted dip or something along those lines, and yes, those are something that we can continually add a lot of strength to and add a lot of progression to, that will have a high level of transference and be a very similar enough exercise to what our competition bench press is. And I think obviously there's some individual nuance there to what we can really leverage for creating a higher benefit. Like say if you have an athlete that has been utilizing a lot of dumbbell bench press, sure, a lot of great hypertrophy benefit there, but also great strength potential. We can get very strong at dumbbell bench pressing. Obviously, there might be some limitations, like our gym's dumbbells only go up to 100 pounds or something like that. So that might be an excuse to make something like a change to a weighted dip or something like that. And I think that there's even an instance to where if the amount of weight on the dumbbells isn't an issue, I'd say even like if we look at like a very technical bench presser where somebody has a very high arch, their USAPL completely elevated rib cage, to where now that bench press, the bar path is almost replicates a decline bench press. Very similar to what we'll see on some sort of a weighted dip. So we'll see that, hey, now we have this very rib position where that force is being transferred along that rib cage instead of away from it nearly as much. So something like a weighted dip that, once again, we can progress to a very large extent, might have more transference than anything to competition bench press than even like a dumbbell bench press would. There might be a lot of cases where it's vice versa, but that's something that, once again, we can get great progress from both. Making that swap there might completely break that plateau and create a lot of great adaptations and strength moving forward. Option number 2 would be some sort of more mechanically similar variation to our barbell movements to implement, obviously on a primary day, but probably more likely on a secondary or tertiary day if you have them, to help us, once again, get some sort of new stimulus, have that novelty there. But I think, once again, that needs to be very intelligently designed. Like, we don't want to just, throw, say if we have a conventional deadlift, or we don't want to throw, a 4-inch block sumo deadlift or something silly like that at them, something that doesn't make any sense and has most likely zero transference to their conventional deadlift. But say if, we know that they are having a hard time with, maintaining positioning, and they just don't have a very healthy hip hinge, maybe treating that secondary day with a very heavy stiff leg to help them teach them to get their hips higher, or a very heavy RDL to help them learn to control that center mass better and just get them a lot stronger at hinging at the hips and a lot more efficient with it. Something like that would make a lot more sense. And then for the instance of bench press, let's say we have something that's, another soft touch technical bench presser there, to where they're having a hard time maintaining or creating tensioning, to where maybe like a soft touch, like a t-shirt touch, to where we're not quite touching the body mass, or say like a 3 count or 2 count pause, trying to maintain that tensioning that entire time. Or something like if they're not having good leg drive, we implement some sort of a tempo bench press. And these could be all implemented on a primary, secondary, or tertiary day that will still introduce a lot of novelty, but still have a very applicable application, a very transferable application as well, to help us continually yield more results and even improve the bench press as a whole, not just for the sake of novelty. So last but not least, we're going to talk about programming. And I think that there's so much that could be discussed here. It's intimidating. So what I'm going to do, instead of just trying to talk about this way too broad of a subject of the thousands of changes or thousands of instances of what we could do to change programming, I'm going to give a very specific instance that I think will help make this make a lot more sense and get the point across a lot better, instead of just trying to make up scenarios kind of like I did talking about variations in the bench press and stuff like that. So I'm going to be talking about and doing a bit of a case study on my client, Brian. He's actually one of my local guys here, and he's very relatable. Once again, I've gotten a few more of those the last couple of years. He's not just some young spring chicken that we can just throw a bunch of workload at him at, and he recovers very well. And it's almost like to where coaching them's too easy. He's one that, hey, we got to be a little bit more intelligent about it. We got to pay attention to a few more, markers. And with him especially, he has a very long torso, which once again I think always adds a unique challenge to somebody's squat and deadlift. But especially with the added range of motion we get onto a squat, that means that workload's going to be a unique challenge as well. If somebody's just built a squat and they have a short torso and short femurs, they can just kind of squat all day and they're going to be a lot less beat up than somebody like Brian would be. But with him, we really kind of, just for the sake of making sure that he was not only enjoying his training, but having a lot less fatigue dumping into his deadlift days, we really got pretty nitpicky with his volume and how we tracked it and did something pretty dang cool. So Brian and I, we've been working together just over 6 blocks at this point. And when I'm working with somebody new, I have some pretty extensive phone calls and ask them probably too many questions and more than I should, but also take in a lot of their past programming and a lot of last training. when they had the most successful training, when they felt like their training's been kind of a lull, what it's looked like very recently, so on and so forth. And I take all that information and put together and make an estimation on what I think, once again, trying to get that quickly figure out that what works for them as quickly and accurately as possible based off that information they've given me. And I do apply all of that they've given me to also just some stuff that I know very generally about all the athletes I've coached in the past and what has worked for people that are quite similar to Brian. So what we did and kind of what we figured out is that, what I started off with his squats is that, hey, he'd been doing a relatively low volume, I'd say when it comes to just working sets and, kind of a bit of a variety on the actual rep ranges. So just kind of discern, some rep ranges and then kind of figure out what was working well. And get us back to a point, because he'd also been taking it pretty easy for quite a while. He'd always trained, but he hadn't been quite into competing shape in quite a while, in a couple of years. So kind of the goal was like, hey, let's figure out a baseline here. Let's figure out what makes that one rep max tick. So I really wanted to try implementing a fatigue single and keeping that nice and chill, and just watching and seeing how the performance of that is affected by the rest of the squat work that we do. Kind of my assumption was first that, hey, I think he'll do pretty well off some, relatively moderate rep ranges. I don't think he'll do super well off low ones. So we gave him some 4s and 5s, something not too crazy. And I'll usually just kind of linearly progress that when I'm first starting with somebody, so we can kind of see that trend of like, hey, after a set of 4s or after a set of 5 or after X amount of volume, that's just one of my markers I am manipulating and changing that variable to see what does apply to that fatigue single. So we actually had a lot of success from that. Even that first block, we ended up squatting 330 pounds to this relatively low RP. I'd say this is about an 8. He said this was the most he'd squatted in quite a long time, but for this bar speed, we were both very excited about it. But the only thing was that, hey, we had still a lot of soreness, and that's something I was kind of worried about from just the higher rep ranges, because that's, once again, not something he was doing that much of. But I think just from everything we discussed, it made a lot of sense to me, which is why I applied it. I think this is where it gets to be important to track a lot of different metrics. I most of the time, I think most powerlifting coaches now, they really utilize for tracking their actual volume of their athletes. The most important and most sought after metric there is the amount of working sets, the amount of sets done that is tracked on paper that's over a certain average intensity, right? I do track that wholeheartedly, but I always just kind of in the background track tonnage. I don't always use it because I think that tracking just tonnage or using just tonnage for making programming decisions can be potentially misleading. Obviously, with the amount of tonnage we can create from doing a set of 10, with a much lighter weight can be a lot more than if we do something significantly heavier with, a lot less reps, and just seeing that, hey, even though sure, we can force a similar tonnage between those two, it will yield a very different result and a very different stimulus. So while I didn't love how much we were just feeling, some soreness and just kind of feeling more beat up from the higher rep sets, and there was a great turnaround in how much that was having fantastic progress onto his 1 rep max, or his estimated 1 rep max, and even just that fatigue single, we were watching us add some weight there and watching it really pick up in bar speed. He just didn't love it. So I was like, all right, we'll kind of keep progressing. We'll get you some lower rep ranges, and we'll see what we can do to kind of, see if we can still get just as much, if not more progress there, making sure that that's not just the only variable that could be producing these results. And we let it progress to lower rep ranges. That's what did create something like this 335. This was 2 blocks later. Barely heavier, but it moved at a much higher RP, I'd say a good 9 to 9.5, significantly slower than what we did 2 blocks ago. And now our rep ranges were down to 3s from 5s, and seeing how much this really kind of hurt performance. But I wasn't so sure that it had to be the rep range. So we kind of took a step back, did some math after we saw this go on for 1 more block after this one. So after those kind of low performing blocks, we'd simply just, all right, we knew your squat was doing really, really well when we did have these higher rep ranges in place. Let's just kind of meet in the middle a bit. Let's do some 4s again. If we see that squat single pick up, gives us more room to experiment with, hey, either we're kind of stuck and need to figure out some options for how do we implement these but keep us fresh, or we need to actually start calculating tonnage and seeing what we can do to get this same result to our top end strength, but not make you sore, not make you beat up, and just make you enjoy training. So after introducing some of the rep sets back in, we kind of saw the same thing. Squat popped off, went really well. Not only did his single start performing way better, but we also saw that, hey, his estimated max, even on his rep sets, went up quite a bit as well. But he did get a little bit more beat up again, kind of not allowing us to focus on deadlifts as much as we'd like. And he's a big deadlifter. He loves deadlifting. So we want to kind of keep that appeased, and just even for the sake of his enjoyment, I think that's very important as well. But really simply, just instead of being like, all right, what's some other variables here that this entails that the higher rep sets could be impacting? So that's where I kind of just look back to old tonnage. Once again, I hardly ever do this. I hardly ever utilize tonnage specifically to help me make some educated decisions. But it was another avenue that we could do to, once again, keep Brian progressing, but keep him happy with his training and keep him enjoying it and keep him less sore to where maybe we can focus on the deadlift just a little bit more. So just taking a look back at it, those blocks where he performed the absolute best. His tonnage was averaging about 4,500 squat tonnage for the whole week, as high as 7,500, kind of having that window over there. Hey, the blocks that we had this much did very, very well. The blocks that performed a little bit more poorly, we ended up seeing a big drop off in his skill. We're about 3,500 to about 5,000, 5,500 tonnage there. So that's where we kind of made the compromise. And even though all those blocks had those varying tonnages, his number of working sets per week was always 7. We kept that completely static. So that's where we changed it on its head. We bumped up his working sets, and we actually vary those working sets now based off of what tonnage is needed instead of the other way around, is that we are going to kind of manipulate his working sets for the week just by utilizing some lower RPE ones. But if we can just do an extra set of 3 and an extra set of 2, that gives us some flexibility to pick up that tonnage back to being in that 5,000 to 7,000 range is kind of our goal. And ever since then, now we have 2 blocks after enabling that. We are now moving 350 way faster than we were any blocks prior just by keeping his tonnage in this very happy spot. And while I do think that the effects and the outcomes here are more important than anything, it's because we're never going to truly find out. We don't have the technology or the science available to figure out the whys of everything at this point in time in powerlifting. But my assumption would be that, sure, we can get that same tonnage he needs. He clearly just needs a certain amount of volume from that perspective in order to thrive. But if it might be that, hey, if us doing 3 sets of 5 at a certain weight instead of 5 sets of 3 at something heavier, sure, we can keep that RPE lower to a standard with something that's slightly heavier, but still get all that tonnage. And that's really, he just recovers from that RPE staying in a very certain range, and we don't need to push that rep set because, once again, just the way his body is built and the way that he, even from a leverage standpoint and even down to a muscular standpoint, something just hits him a lot harder about those higher rep sets, and that is very okay. So to summarize, him going from an average tonnage of roughly 5,000 to 7,000 at 7,000 at 7 working sets per week to keeping that tonnage, but having a variability of his working sets per week be from 8 to 10, depending on our rep ranges, has yielded the exact same results, but kept us a lot more fresh and enabled us to perform at a much higher level. Once again, pretty easy in hindsight, but it's something that that's something I don't think a lot of coaches would do and not have that data tracking in place to be able to do this. That's why I think that is such an important part. And if you're an athlete, fill out your spreadsheet so your coach can do these things, and giving great feedback like Brian does helps not only equip us with more information to just get you better results. And as always, on top of this, I'm such an open book. I've been involved in powerlifting for 15 years now, come up on 20 years. And it's something I love talking about. So obviously, my book's always near full, but if you have any questions, please talk to me, please reach out. And if I'm not available for coaching, I have a good system of coaches that I'd love to refer you out to.